Saturn in the 7th house mostly affects universality. And we can break the concept of universality into 3 segments: bias, patience, and independence. When we talk about bias, what we're talking about is your bias in partnerships. And when we talk about patience, we mean how patient are you in interacting with those partnerships. And when we talk about independence, we mean how independent are you from having a home base. Let me explain why these are the 3 topics to interpret when Saturn is in the 7th house. Let's start with this bias in choosing partners. Saturn is the planet of commoners, common people. And the 7th is the house of people that you interact with. But because the very nature of Saturn is scrutinizing, the combination of Saturn in the 7th house is therefore really about how you select your partners from the common pool. The second subject of Saturn in the 7th, which is your patience in interactions, well, that's because Saturn has to do with being alone, being alienated and being alone. And the 7th house has to do with the opposite, being together. So what's being described when Saturn is in the 7th house is how well you can tolerate that antipolar urge, on the one hand to be together with other people, but on the other hand to get away from other people. And the third issue, which is your independence from having a home base, is because Saturn has to do with wandering, again, because it's about being alienated or exiled. And the 7th has to do with destinations because it's literally the western horizon where the sun sets. And again, Saturn's overall theme is sadness and how well you deal with sadness. So Saturn in the 7th house, therefore, will describe how much you feel inconvenienced by having to leave your home. Now, that's all just a quick summary. We're going to get into detail about it all in this video. Don't worry if you don't exactly get it yet. Now, all of the themes of Saturn in the 7th house are going to depend upon how positive or negative Saturn is there. So what we should do is outline a positive and a negative permutation for each one of these 3 themes. For the first theme, your bias in selecting partners, on the positive side, Saturn in the 7th house makes you impartial about who you'll interact with. But on the negative side of that same theme, it's not that you're impartial, it's that you're indiscriminate. The second theme, which is your tolerance in partnerships, the positive version of that is that you're very patient with people. But the negative version of it is that you easily get irritated. As for the third theme, which is how independent you are from your home base, positive Saturn in the 7th house means you're quite independent, you travel often. Negative Saturn in the 7th house means you're very displaced, you're never really at home. Now, these are the quick summary points for the positive and negative sides of each of the 3 themes. We're going to dive more deeply into what each one of these things actually implies. But first of all, you're probably wondering how you know whether you should interpret the positive side of Saturn in the 7th or the negative side of Saturn in the 7th. Well, it's all based on the positivity mainly of Saturn itself and alternatively of the whole chart overall. The more positive the whole chart and Saturn is, the more you stress on the positive interpretations. The more negative the whole thing is, the more you stress on the negative interpretations. And the more middle it is, the more you moderate the interpretations. So I will explain how to figure that out at the end of this video. And also, if you're not the mathematical type, I figure it out for you in the reports that I offer. So if you want, you can go to my website, victicara.com, and order one of my reports, and it will tell you exactly how positive or negative, and therefore how much stress to put on either the positive or the negative traits. Now let's get into more detail about the implications of each one of these keywords. So let's start off with being impartial and unbiased. What I'm saying here is positive Saturn in the 7th house is impartial about who they want to work with, who they want to deal with, who they want to relate with, who they want to be with. That means that they're very practical about selecting those people They're very fair about it. They'll feel like grounded people. They'll feel like people who don't have their noses in the air. They'll feel like they're not elitists. And they're also very inclusive. Like they don't have prejudice or bias and rule people out just on the basis of some prejudged circumstance. Now, a negative Saturn in the 7th house, on the other hand, is not going to turn out to be the opposite of that. It's just going to turn out to be a negative result from that. So negative Saturn in the 7th house is indiscriminate. That was the key word. So what we mean by this is not really taking enough scrutiny of a potential partner. Being so open to commoners and so open to anybody that you just assume that this person is going to be okay. They're fine with me, or anybody's okay for me. I have no right to be picky. So if you look at some charts of famous people who have Saturn in the 7th house to illustrate these points, we've got Traci Lords, the very early era porn star. So a very good example of just accepting anybody into an interpersonal relationship. And you can see that her Saturn in the 7th house is not just debilitated, but it's very exaggerated by its close contact with Rahu. We also have the example of Russell Brand. His Saturn in the 7th is not really doing great, and his whole chart is kind of martialized and aggressive because of it having only 3 signs occupied and having his moon with Mars in a Mars sign. Thirdly, we could also mention Johnny Depp because he's sort of famous for the Amber Heard incident or the trials, what have you. So also not very selective or careful about his partner. And if you look at his chart, it's obviously his Saturn in the 7th house is much better off than these other 2 people, but still it's the 6th Lord in the 7th house. And it's relying on this very unstable moon due to its contact with Ketu. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, the positive variant, we have the example of Judy Blume. Hopefully you guys know who Judy Blume is because she's an extremely important author from a couple of decades ago. She wrote children's books about topics that weren't commonly explained to children. She is extremely liberal. She's extremely open-minded. She's extremely inclusive in her views. Now, her Saturn in the 7th might not look very great, but it's in a n.b.r.y Raj Yoga. And also, it's not like it's just producing great things for her. She had 2 failed marriages, and only the 3rd one worked out well. So she also does have that indiscriminacy in partnerships. But the n.b.r.y Raj Yoga is giving something really great out of Saturn in the 7th house, as well as the difficult stuff. Another example of Saturn in the 7th in a positive condition is Joe Biden. Basically a liberal and inclusive type of politician. And his Saturn in the 7th is really good. Not only does it have pretty decent dignity, but it's in something called Adhi Yoga, while it's surrounded or hemmed by 2 exalted planets, the Moon and Jupiter. Moving on to the second theme, how tolerant you are of other people when you're interacting with them. Positive Saturn in the 7th house is very patient with people. For example, if you have a conversation with this person, they are probably not going to get irritated with you right away if you don't understand what they're talking about immediately. If you're doing a business exchange with this person, they will be waiting for the deadlines that they're supposed to wait for, and they will kind of understand reasonable delays. They also tend to tolerate flaws in other people and understand those flaws and accept them. On the other hand, negative Saturn in the 7th house is pretty much exactly the opposite. It's very impatient when it's dealing with other people. So that will come off in like a conversation as you better understand what they're saying right away, otherwise they'll get annoyed or they won't explain it fully to you. You better be on time, for example, because they get impatient right away. If you're doing a business interaction with this person, you better be showing them progress because they're easily going to get nervous that things are not on schedule and that you're not delivering what you're supposed to deliver. this is the type of person that kind of you might describe as having anger issues. It's not exactly an anger issue, but it's an irritation issue. They get annoyed easily. And then that annoyance builds up frustration, and then they act out in some kind of thing that appears to be anger. So as for people who have this, it's not so easy to really know these kind of personality traits in celebrities, at least not for me. And I'm not really interested in dedicating that much time to researching it. But I think it's safe to say that these same people that we used for the previous example are still pretty good examples here. Somebody like Judy Blume, Joe Biden, they're slow-paced, they are patient and tolerant and kind of easier to work with. Whereas these people like Russell Brand and probably Johnny Depp, definitely Johnny Depp, they have those kind of anger issues where it's frustration and irritation builds up inside of them, and then it acts out in a sudden explosion. We come to the third topic, which is how independent are you from a home base? If Saturn in the 7th house is positive, then you really don't need a home base. Anywhere is your home base. You feel fine anywhere. You're very comfortable traveling. So you're always in the road, and you like it, and you don't really have strong roots set down anywhere, but that doesn't make you feel unrooted. It makes you feel independent and free. So, for example, this is the kind of person who can travel with a backpack instead of a big suitcase. This is the kind of person who can do a lot of commuting even back and forth to work. It's not really about relocation to other places. It's about just being away from your base, being out on the road. But the negative version of this is displacement. In other words, you feel that you have been pushed out of your home. You feel that you have been exiled. You're on the road and you wish you had a place to rest that was your place. And so you feel kind of homeless. You feel kind of baseless and rootless. To consider some example charts for this, we have Ramana Maharshi and Kurt Cobain. Neither of these charts really have Saturn in particularly positive dignity. But Cobain's is in a chart that only has 3 signs occupied. Compare that to Ramana Maharshi, who has 7 signs occupied. In Cobain's chart, the 3rd and the 11th and Venus are very strong, very positive. And that is, in fact, what his 7th house, Saturn, is directly tied to by virtue of Saturn's Lord, Jupiter, being the one that's in the 11th house, exalted with the moon, the 11th Lord. And not only that, it's in a mutual aspect with that Lord. So what you get with Kurt Cobain is he's an artist. The reason why he's always on the road, the reason why he's displaced, is that he's an artist, or the way that it plays out that he's always on the road is that he's an artist. He's a musician, so he's always touring. Now, you know Kurt Cobain's psychology and mental health wasn't good, and part of the reason is this Saturn in the 7th house, giving him this sense of not having a peaceful base. Ramana Maharshi, on the other hand, you might think, well, he should illustrate a positive Saturn, but his Saturn doesn't look too positive in this chart. Actually, Ramana Maharshi's life is not an easy, comfortable life either, by any stretch. In many ways, it's more austere than Cobain's. It's just that in Maharshi's chart, he's got this basis of having 7 signs occupied as opposed to 3, which really helps a lot. And also, his Saturn in the 7th isn't tied to 11th and 3rd house with artistic tendencies. His is tied to a house exchange between the 8th and the 2nd by virtue of Saturn's Lord being in that exchange. And that exchange of the 8th and the 2nd really highlights the dichotomy between materialism and spiritualism, between the manifest and the occult. So what's playing out with his Saturn in the 7th house is the reason why he doesn't need a home base is because he has some spiritual insight into the nature of bases, the nature of permanence, the nature of safety. So these are the things that you really need to know about Saturn in the 7th house if you want to interpret it accurately. Again, the only challenge in making any interpretation is how to scale the interpretation towards a positive side or a negative side. So now let's go over how you would figure that out. First of all, the most basic consideration is the sign dignity. I've recently published 3 or 4 videos on this exact topic. Saturn in the 1st house in Aries is not the same as Saturn in the 1st house in Libra, and it would be ridiculous to think that it is. It's because Saturn in Aries is in fall and Saturn in Libra is exalted. And there's this whole spectrum of dignity in between exaltation and fall. And if you want to know that in detail, check those videos to figure out how you calculate dignity. In addition to the sign dignity that a planet has in a house, you also want to think about how the house itself is either advantageous or deleterious to the planet's dignity. If the planet is a malefic or the sun or the nodes, then it is at an advantage if it's in houses 3, 6, 10, or 11, but it's in a disadvantage if it's in 1, 4, 5, or 9. And if it's at an advantage, you just give a bonus to its dignity. I give 25%. And if it's at a disadvantage, you subtract some of its dignity. I subtract 25%. If it's one of the other planets, the benefics, along with the moon or Mercury, then the advantageous or bonus houses are 1, 4, 5, 9, and 10, and the disadvantageous houses are 3 and 6. Finally, the third step is to consider the lordship of this planet. If a planet is the lord of certain houses, then it gets a bonus to its dignity. If it's the lord of other houses, then it might get a detriment. So the best house to be the lord of is the first, because the lord of the first wants to protect the whole chart because the whole chart belongs to it. Also, it's very positive to be the lord of a trine, the 5th or the 9th. And it's also somewhat positive to be the lord of the 4th or the 10th. It's disadvantageous, however, to be the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th. There's a loophole about this. If the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th is occupying the 6th, 8th, or 12th, then it's not a disadvantageous thing. It's an advantageous thing. And what you would subtract, you instead add to the dignity. So if it's confusing, or you just want to see exactly how I do it, don't worry. You can do that. You can go to my website, victicara.com, click into the report section, and then you have an option to get either just the basic chart, or you can also get the subdivisions. So please consider doing that. And also, please, if you haven't subscribed, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave me a comment, let me know what you're thinking. Also, just you doing that helps YouTube spot this video and show it to other people. So I would really appreciate that. Thank you very much.